Welcome back to day 3 of the CogX 2020 conference, where our theme this year is how do we get the next 10 years right? You're here listening to the Planet, Cities and Space stage. I'm sure many of you have just heard a fascinating panel discussing on the role of consumers of getting to net zero carbon in the energy sector. Later on this afternoon, we'll be hearing on Microsoft about how they're trying to get to net negative carbon. Before then, we're going to space, and Katherine Courtney, who will be leading a panel on innovation in space.
Thanks, Andrew. Just to quickly introduce myself, I'm Katherine Courtney, an independent advisor, non-executive director, and STEM ambassador, primarily in the space sector. I chair the Global Network on Sustainability in Space, which works to bring scientists, industry, and policymakers together to accelerate progress on space traffic management. I'm also a former chief executive of the UK Space Agency. I'm absolutely delighted to have this opportunity today to speak with Anne Vandenbroucke, Frank Salzgeber, and Joshua Letcher about space innovation. We may not have Anne with us straight away. I know that the team are working on getting her onto the stage. Hopefully when Anne joins us, I'll give a brief intro to her anyway. She is the Chief Regulatory Officer at Avanti Communications Group. Her team deals with all matters relating to optimizing the use of Avanti spectrum, their orbital positions, and creating routes to market. She was also involved in developing the UK government's space innovation and growth strategy. But even without Anne, I'm very pleased to welcome Frank Salzgeber from the European Space Agency. He's the head of innovation and ventures for ESA. His team has initiated over 370 industry tech transfers and supported over 800 startups. He also promotes ESA business applications, which is an ESA program that supported a further 500 business cases. ESA has over 21 business incubation centers across Europe, and they plan to invest 220 million euros in business cases and startups in the next 3 years. And hello to Joshua Letcher, joining us from Australia. Hi, Joshua is the founder of Space Industries, who have developed a lunar resource extraction vehicle to produce water and helium-3 on the moon. He has over 15 years experience in the mining and resources industry, and he also used to serve as a submariner in the Royal Australian Navy. So welcome to you both. Hopefully Anne will join us. I want to, before we kick off, invite the audience to go ahead and submit questions if you like. If we don't get to them during the panel, we'll try and pick them up in the breakout Q&A session that will be running just after this session. But let me get started by asking both of you to tell us all what you think is the one innovation causing the greatest disruption to the space industry today, and why? Let's start with you, Frank.
I think there's not only one innovation; it's the combination. And I would in this I would not focus on the technology. I think the biggest driver at the moment are the new business models, so that we have commercial entities pushing the boundaries, and this has an impact to all of the space application. In navigation, so positioning, GNSS, in Earth observation, in launchers, and of course in telecommunication. So it's the change of the business model, which drives the startups, the non-space industry, really pushing it. I think this is the biggest innovation. And to explain that, maybe, and make the bridge also to Joshua, why we should not ask Gas de France or Air Liquide to provide gas helium-3 on the moon. So space becomes a normal commodity. And I think this is the big change.
So Frank, just explain for the audience, you know, what the old business model looked like and how the new business models are disrupting that.
I think we had a great start with SpaceX, and you need sometimes people pushing the boundaries. So I would say our office sometimes, we are sometimes the aliens in ESA, because you have a standard way, and then of course you need innovation inside and the innovation from the outside. In the past, you were buying a rocket, shoot it in the air, and that's gone. Now you're reusing it. Now you have microsatellites, you have smaller timing in orbit, but lower Earth orbit. So this is always the business model. You have more VC backed up. So it's going away from the typical government part, which pays everything. ESA is still needed because we de-risk until industry can take over. But all what we see with new space is driven by new business models. Yeah, when you're seeing, and maybe Anne could speak about that in Avanti, in the past, the business model of telecommunication were the disk on your house. But your kids, my kids, they watch YouTube. They watch Netflix. It's not coming and broadcasting via satellite anymore. The future of Satcom will be broadband, the Internet of Things, mega constellation. So, and I think the business model at the moment is really changing the entire space business. And I always say change is the salt in the soup called destiny. So change is always good because it moves things. It paves the way for new innovation.
Joshua, I definitely want to hear what you think is the single most important disruption, but I'd also like to hear your reflections on what Frank just said. I mean, you're an example, aren't you, of a disruptive new business model?
We're definitely getting there. I think the biggest technology so far has been launch, ease of access to space with the reduction in the cost to get to space, and mostly with SpaceX and reusable launch systems that they have. I think one of the biggest things is a commercial focus to space, and that stems from space, and the Moon and Mars is essentially two different new countries that have been that we've got access to. So a lot of the Earth-based companies are obviously excited about going to space, and the opportunity there is so large where if any business that you do on Earth, you can essentially have an opportunity to be the company that does that on Mars or the company that does that on the Moon. And I think that's why so many people are really engaged with the space industry.
Okay. So certainly, the cost of launch coming down is a pretty disruptive change. I did sort of, take you on the hop to say you had to just pick one. Are there any others that you would add to the list that you think are particularly disruptive?
I'll probably focus on moving forward with space. So I think what's going to be disruptive going forward is the production of resources to sustain humans on the Moon and on Mars also. And then I think the other disruptive ones will be habitats. So when we've got the ability to stay on the Moon or Mars with habitats, and also to produce the resources to grow crops, to produce propellant in space and just survive there, then it opens up the floodgates to a lot of other different areas moving forward, I think.
Okay. Frank, what about you? Anything else you'd add to the list?
Yes, and I think the two say which Josh said. One is the lower Earth economy, including Moon. And maybe I do not like the word that Mars and Moon is a new country, because a country belongs to somebody. And space and Moon belongs to nobody, even when some presidents and countries think that. This is the beauty of space. It's for all mankind, like the open sea. And maybe that should be more treated like the Svalbard Treaty, that everybody can participate for peaceful use. So that is the first thing, lower Earth orbit economy. The other part which drives space for the next at least decade, if not longer, is that space is becoming the backbone of the digital infrastructure. Mm. At the moment, we are building in space a laser communication network. So it's a backbone laser communication network in space, because normal broadcasting will not do it. So the three elements to have: telecommunication, that is Internet of Things, Earth observation, which is booming, and still GNSS with navigation and timing. So these three really pillars from the funding and from the industry perspective are driving space. This is why we need more launchers. We need the launch costs going down. And this will benefit then also the lower Earth economy and the future stepping out of further outposts.
Okay. I think if Anne had been able to join us by now, she would have some views on the Moon and Mars being treated like new countries or talked about as new countries. That's a pretty raging debate in the space community and outside. I know we recently saw the directive in April from the US administration effectively declaring the Moon a a free-for-all zone for commercial exploitation. I won't go into politics with
but
details.
But maybe I can add. I'm 50, and I was still with the military service in Germany, and there were the red airplanes and the blue airplanes. You can guess which one. So there was really a line between what is good and what is bad, or at least the people told. So, and I love seeing the space station when you have the cosmonauts, astronauts sitting together in the table on the Russian segment, enjoying their food, enjoying even their dishes. And all the astronauts, Andrei Karpov brought that picture back, and you see a very nice shot. You see the Sinai, the river of Nile, Israel, and some other countries, and the little bit shady thing which makes the atmosphere. And I think that's this amazing picture which our astronauts bring back, because this is peaceful, and we have to keep that somehow.
Yeah, I think I like to say that space by definition has no borders, and actually is one of the areas that even if there is strife and competition between nations on the ground, that actually space, particularly for scientific objectives, is a place where countries cooperate, collaborate, and work well together. However, I think that the increasing introduction of commercial operations into space does challenge that. So I'm one of those who believes that actually we should be debating that more, and that the regulatory frameworks around the world need to move faster to keep up with all of that innovation, because these new business models, that we want to make sure that we can encourage new space businesses to thrive and survive, but at the same time, protect what is unique about space, and perhaps not make some of the mistakes that we may have made on our own home planet so far.
You're absolutely right.
I think I'm going to come back to talk a bit about the Moon and Mars as territories for colonization or habitation, exploitation, etc. But first, I'd like to get your thoughts about going back a bit to the business models. What is the role now? Your views about the private sector versus public sector funding landscape. How is that transforming technology? How is it transforming the space industry? And I'd like you to talk about, now what's the current situation, but also where you think it's going. What's the next 10 years going to look like? Joshua, let's hear from you first.
Yeah. I think recently we've seen a fair few companies participate in fund rounding rounds and be quite successful. My experience there is we haven't progressed to a funding round yet. I think that we've definitely had a lot of interest. So a lot of general VC firms are starting to have a look at the space industry. With space becoming commercialized, it's not as long a period till you get a return on investment. So it's definitely something that's more appealing.
What's your view about the role of institutional funding in encouraging innovation? We talked about the European Space Agency incubators, for instance. Where do you think the job is for government, and where should they step back, let the private sector step in?
A lot of the institutional investors, not so much on the government side, but the way that they're focused is on technologies that benefit the space or have a space application, but also have a main focus is on the Earth application. So there's a few programs like the NASA iTech program, which we participated in, and a lot of the technologies there are very focused on the Earth aspect. There's a number of other good programs. ESABIC as well has a lot of good companies going through them which have really good Earth-based applications. So I think we'll see a lot more of that as well.
Frank, European Space Agency is not, doesn't represent a government. It's not a government agency. Oh, we have Anne. Fantastic. Anne, welcome.
We should have done this by satellite.
Yeah, exactly. Could I ask you to turn your camera the other way around? Possibly, we might get a better picture of you. I don't know if it's feasible with whatever device you're using. If it is possible to turn it, but otherwise, we're very happy to see you. We were just in the middle of talking about the role of government funding, public sector funding, versus private sector funding in encouraging innovation. And I was asking Frank, you know, coming from a membership body, as it were, but where the underlying budgets are voted from national budgets, where, you know, what's your view on where the role that those two sources of funding should play, do play?
Well, it's very interesting, and it'd be good to have a little bit of a shift in there, because very often they are to the private and the public sector meeting. It's a bit like chalk and cheese. Both have very good things to work out due to a clash of culture, but very often because even though it's a public-private partnership, the roles are distinct, and it's based on a kind of a subcontracting role rather than actually a close collaboration role.
Oh, and I think we're still having some technical problems with your connection. So I'm going to throw that back to Frank while we see if something can be done there.
I think in general, you have to have both. Success has more than one mother and father. So the multi-government organizations like ESA are very good in the beginning. I think Anne is still speaking.
There, I actually think something is shifting.
Oh dear.
Okay. Let's try it again. I think you need both. You know, and we supported startups since 16 years. So, and at that time, the people were in the space industry were not even laughing. That means we're not recognized. Now, supporting over 800, and I think shortly we reach 900. We do a pretty good job. And it's up to, and this is to Joshua, it's up to the entrepreneur what they want to do. It's not up to us. So, and I had my own startup company. I worked for Apple. So we try to be as commercial as possible to our startups. So if you want to develop a rocket, and we have some of them, it's your choice. If you want to do downstream, it's also your choice. We increase the likelihood of the success in an early stage. And we just have one company which is doing flying taxis, and they just achieved a 1 billion evaluation, which is not bad for a startup. We helped them when there were 4 really entrepreneurs and not more. So, and the Irish have a very nice saying, on the shoulders of the giants you see further. Our job as a multi-government organization is to be the giant who allow the startup, the SME, climbing on our shoulders, even down if they want to. So, and this helps to de-risk the business until the business angel community, the venture capital community can really step in. And what we learned, and we have asked all of our startups, until 1 million is not an issue. You get it easily. If your team and your technology is good, easily. And even locally. 10 million, you also get in the community. The problems what we have are the 50 million, 100, 200 billion tickets. So this is what we're challenging at the moment. So, but I think the role of the government is to de-risk, and sometimes it takes time. Sometimes you need a half year. We are the uncle with the right address book and the right love, being honest to you, but also a little bit pocket money, and really connecting the people. But making our kids, and everybody who has kids knows that, to have them taking their responsibility for themselves. It's not our job to tell them what to do. They have to find. We have to educate them, help them into the time that they can grow, and then let them run. And if we did all right, maybe we got a Hanukkah, Christmas, or a Ramadan card back that we have done a good job as parents.
Are there some areas though of space technology and space innovation that you feel should or must be funded by government, maybe because the risks are so high that that it wouldn't attract any private sector investment, and other areas where the government should get out of the way? I'd like to hear your views on that.
As I said, I have a very American view on that because I worked a lot for Apple. The government should get out as soon as possible. That's the first rule, because and the market should take over. And we should really focus where we can added value and then step outside. And of course, if you make Earth observation software, you're pretty cash flow positive pretty soon. I just had a call with a big VC company, US and Luxembourg based, and about launchers. Of course, making a launcher is, even when a micro launcher, is much harder, and you will take much more time. And what Joshua is doing to think about mining on the moon, you have to think about how you can maybe get the property rights, how you can maybe hedge property rights, like you hedge copper prices in 10 years. So I think you need different methods, and this is where the government has to maybe have a long perspective. Software is an easy win because in 2 years you can really make money. But if you want to mining on the moon, that takes long, and it takes more investors who look long term. Yeah, maybe my joke is always, and it's not a joke, you have to think like the Catholic Church. You have to in three generations, and they're in business since 2,000 years, so it can't be so bad.
Joshua, so do you think that there are areas? I mean, interestingly, Mariana Mazzucato was on the CogX leadership stage. I think it was on the first day of this conference, and talking about her mission-led innovation. Her view. I don't know if you've heard of her. She's an economist working out of the UK here, and her view is that basically governments should set big, ambitious missions. Her example that she uses is put a man on the moon, by the end of the decade, and bring him home safely. And then they should allow all of that, innovation that flows from that to be, to go its own way, to be exploited. Her view is, she uses the example also of the iPhone, saying, how the iPhone only exists because of many, many government-funded R&D programs. Interestingly, she also says that taxpayers should get a return on that investment, that it shouldn't just be grant funding, where you hand the money out and then let all the startups run away with the big valuations and their shareholders benefit. Anyway, it would be, good to hear your view as a startup. What is the role of government funding in your view versus the private sector?
Yeah. So as a startup, with doing what we're doing, sometimes I put us into a different basket to normal startups, or to the majority of startups, which just have, say, a single product focus, like a CubeSat that takes photos or looks for bushfires, and that's their product. Whereas what we're doing is we're developing a lunar extraction vehicle, which is a rover. That rover can then mine gases. It can do multiple different things. It can do earthwork, construction, it can do experiments, and then along with that, we've also got a lander capability which converts into other purposes, like fuel storage. So what we're doing is, I think, a different level of a traditional startup where there's an actual full mission or end-to-end mission. And then when we look at, for us, we look at the government, and we want the government to support us, because the government support us opens up the doors to the smaller funding opportunities like the VC funds. But also we would prefer the government to do a larger mission like ours, because it off of a mission that's going to provide so much benefit stems a lot of other technologies that can be used on Earth as well as in space. Like, for example, to produce our rover vehicle, we are building pretty sure it's the largest 3D printer for peak material. And that's the technology that can work in the oil and gas industry. So all the pipe work, the seals and gaskets, which are currently nylon and Teflon, can be replaced with PEEK gaskets. So I think from our side, we would like to see government funding and government supporting a larger mission, even if they didn't fund us directly as the startup. If they funded, say, Lockheed Martin or Jacobs or one of the bigger space primes, and then the primes engaged us at a request from the space agency, or even just engaged 70% of that, say, budget for that mission went to startups and involved startups, would that would help startups, I think. So.
Good. Well, I think, it's an interesting debate about how, the taxpayer gets their return on those investments, Frank.
But I have a good news, and that was in the last ministerial. We have one startup in Switzerland, which we supported at the beginning. It's a spin-off from ESPL, and it's called ClearSpace. And ClearSpace, and I think the contract is about 140 million, and they become the prime. So Airbus is the subcontractor. And the startup, I think they had only a round of 500,000. It's about deorbiting and cleaning the orbit and maybe even recycling things. So I think there are good news outside. We need more of that. And as I understand that was made in space. So I think that is very promising. And I think this is also the job of our government. And trust me, it's always hard in a government organization to push that. Huh? So therefore, every government organization needs a chief devil officer. That would be my favorite title. And push the boundaries and say, let now 3 startups try that. And if it's failing, we try it again. That is about innovation.
Well, we'll move on from that topic. We've got Anne back with us. I hope, Anne, that you don't freeze up again, but perseverance.
Let's not be Laura from Frozen.
We'll try. We're going to move on to a slightly different topic. I think at the beginning, which you may have missed, and we talked about what the most disruptive innovations are today. And Frank made the point that, actually, there's some very mature technologies that, we're all very dependent on today already, and mentioned several of those. And what I'm curious to explore a bit more is how space technology is already impacting the Earth, because I'm not sure everybody in the audience is familiar with that, and the benefits that they bring, and whether there, are any risks that we should be alive to. So maybe I'll pass to you first, since we've got you back, Anne, to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you very much. Well, as we saw this week with the docking into the International Space Station, space always speaks to the imagination, and that is something people know about. But as we see in these times of COVID, when it's about there's a crisis or an economic crisis lurking, and it's very legitimate that people ask the question, but why are we putting all these millions and billions into space when we have problems here on Earth? I think sometimes space is so successful. As long as something is a technology, it needs to do more work. And as soon as it's so completely embedded in day-to-day life, people don't even realize anymore the technology is there. And I think space has been very successful, so successful that people don't really realize what it means in their daily lives. Weather forecast depends on it, and satellite is really, really, really good and space is really good in general at bringing coverage. So while we're doing already a lot to bring internet to areas like shipping, like areas that are struck by a disaster and where all terrestrial communication has been wiped out, and that is very recognized or as a role for satellite. Perhaps there's a little bit more to be done there, and in addition, to continue with the research and development to embed space-related applications, GPS, weather forecasting, television, internet to remote areas. Perhaps there's a little bit more to be done, because we've been very successful in space to influence and be part of the life of the connected. And I would actually think that where we need to go now is to go to the areas which are still unconnected and do more research, more investment in making the communications more affordable for the half of the population or third of the population that's still totally unconnected. That would be what I think can be done more.
That's a very interesting new point that you raise. Joshua, I think, what you're talking about, your technologies are for use on other planets. What do you see as the benefit back on Earth from those technologies?
Yeah, so focusing on the mining industry, so the technology and the processing method that we've developed for the moon, for the regolith, can be incorporated back to Earth for a lot of the lower grade deposits. So at the moment, you've got the big BHPs, Rio, Glencore, and they're mining some really big high grade resources. But looking forward to the next 20, 30 years, those resources will be coming to an end, and the only other resources then have, instead of a 60% grade of iron ore, they have a 30% grade of iron ore. So they need to look at new technologies, and that's where the space technologies can come in for new beneficiation processes to then improve the grades of the resources here on Earth as well.
Okay, Frank, did you have any further reflections on that?
Yeah, I'm doing tech transfer from space since 15 years. So Joshua, totally right. I'm a big fan. I think it's much better to use stuff which you invented already and then transfer it than reinvent the wheel. Navigation in general, we have a generation which never get lost, besides the iPhone runs out of power or the Google, whatever. So that is normal. And our cell phone access points use the timing and our power grid. So navigation usage, GNSS is everywhere. I like what Anne said with SATCOM, and Nicholas Negroponte made a nice speech, how we can connect the last billion. There's an amazing, and when we're speaking also to STEM, there's an amazing project, the Pacific Female Satellite Network. So that's about education. Satellite gives education, and that gives out of poverty a chance. I think this is amazing, and we have to connect the last billion for a cheaper price. A project like the Brick in Kenya, which also used then satellite connection. Earth observation I love because you cannot cheat from Earth. If there's a deforestation, somebody can tell it's not happening. Space shows it's happening. If somebody thinks I have to pump oil out of my ship, we catch them. If you want really a CO2 driven or less CO2 driven economy, you also have to measure the patient. Space is doing that. So I think in all of these areas, we have a lot of powerful tool sets we just have to use. And this is the downstream industry. We do not work with the upstream industry making this infrastructure in space.
I think, we've maybe have all been struck by the images from satellites of the Earth during lockdown and how dramatically air quality improved all over the world in the hot spots around the world. And that became something that was very obvious from the space data, that was collected. And hopefully, those images will help people think about, actually how we monitor impacts going forward. I guess what I'd like to talk about, because you talk a lot about what was already using beneficially on the Earth, but are there, any risks to that level of dependence on space technologies? I just published an article yesterday where I would argue that actually, we are increasingly reliant and perhaps not spending enough time thinking about the risks and how the risks should be mitigated. Personally, I call for, not only better technical solutions and operating agreements for all of these new space, technology models that are going up and business models, all the new emerging new space activities that are going on. But also, I think regulatory frameworks need to move a whole lot faster around the world. So I'd be interested in the panel's views on that.
Sure.
Well,
we'll start with Anne.
Yeah, as a regulatory expert, I live and breathe that kind of thing, and you're absolutely right. Once you get out of the research and development stage, and something starts to be implemented to a degree, it's absolutely normal that a stable regulatory framework is developed. What I would like to say is, space debris is and space situational awareness is a hot topic. There's a risk that we kind of pollute pollute space, and that people who tell their children they should look at the stars, their children say, yes, but all I see is satellites, and that has beauty in itself. what needs to be done there? First of all, the thing to realize is that space is incredibly safe, and it's already regulated to a large extent, both nationally and internationally. And the systems that are there can still work for the new environment. And where more needs to be done, it often is a case not necessarily of over-regulating, but of different constituents talking to each other, the radio astronomers talking to the space sector, and of industry itself working together to map the objects in space and to work together to manage a clean environment.
And Frank and Joshua, your thoughts on any risks and how we mitigate them?
I think if we don't go to space, then we limit progression as well. And at the moment, the Earth's going through a phase with global warming and other events that we need to keep progressing with our technology. For example, data centers are growing at 18% per year, using considerable amounts of energy, which is greenhouse gases, which then flows to other negative impacts on the Earth. But if we utilize space with natural temperatures that are lower, we can reduce that energy demand and consumption here on Earth, and reduce the impacts to the environment. And there's another number of other technologies with a similar sort of outcome as well if we keep progressing with space.
Interesting. Frank, your view on risks?
As I said, I was an entrepreneur myself, and as a founder, I see opportunities. And Katherine, you said it nice. Our astronauts are our best ambassadors, and I think space should inspire. We all agree on that, and I think it's up to us how we build it. And there's a nice treaty. I think 2 big treaties where nearly everybody signed it, and one of the treaty called the Svalbard Treaty, Spitsbergen, and they signed it in 1920. So that is 100 years ago, and that means in Spitsbergen everybody can enter without a visa. You're not allowed to pollute the land, and there are very high standards in terms of environment protection. So and you have a lot of young population there, and I think it's amazing. It's not part of the Norway country, but they rule it and manage it. And I think for space we need something which is inspiring, peaceful, working together. ESA has 22 member states, and I think this is why we work together so well. Sometimes, of course, we have discussions, but they are fruitful discussions because it brings us further. We do that jointly. And I think this we should have also for space, that space becomes the inspiring part for the next generation, this generation, the coming up generation, and the following generation. This is how we do it. And this, I think it's peaceful together and looking back. And like Mr. Hawkins said, don't like to look out to our feet. Let's look into the stars.
Look up. Thank you. Well, I so many things that I'd like to follow up on with that, but we are running slightly low on time, so I'll carry those over into our breakout Q&A. And if anybody who's listening has questions that they want to be putting in, we will also pick those up in the Q&A. So just before we go, what I would like to do is go back to this topic of Moon and Mars now that we have Anne with us. And I guess the question is sort of quickly, if you can, why go to the Moon? Why go to Mars? What are the key steps that we need to take to do it? Let's start with Joshua.
The ultimate for going to the Moon is to preserve humanity. If something happens to Earth, the Moon is a little shell there that we could potentially preserve humanity. But then the other aspect is the Moon has resources that Earth doesn't have, and those resources potentially is the future for energy here on Earth. And energy is probably one of our biggest weaknesses here on Earth, which pollutes the environment and destroys where we live, our habitat.
So what are the key steps then to getting there, to achieving that?
Yeah, I think the biggest step's just been achieved, which is commercial flight. The next step would be to establishing a colony, which is part of what the Artemis missions are doing, and that's basically a global mission. So producing a resource and which is water, water being able to provide all of our utilities. So here, our gas, power, water, and all the utilities can come purely just from water alone on the moon. And then with that, the habitats to sustain people there as well. And then that's the backbones of the economy that we have here on Earth and will be in space as well.
Anne, do you have views on Moon and Mars, human habitation on Moon and Mars? And
I'm afraid I'm very much an Earthling, and what I see is that it's an aspiration. It is just like recreating an environment in the hostile environment of outer space, and it brings what this does. It brings together new advanced technologies who are developing independently of each other, artificial intelligence, quantum, automatization, digitization, space flight, and it brings all of that together into a new model. So things that have been developed independently come together to form something new, and that is very, very exceptional in history, that there's a time when the time is ripe for all of these things to converge. What I would really hope is that by setting our goal to recreate a new safe environment for humankind in space, we actually can take the technology development and the societal thinking that comes from that to actually apply it back to Earth. And also, while we're expanding our universe, have more space, it also benefits us on Earth.
Frank, let's hear your views.
Why we do that? Because a society stops exploring, stops progressing. And we are, especially in Europe, are explorer. So this is, I think, the why. How? I like really the idea of our Director General with the Moon Village. And this would be like a normal village. That means you have a company who is taking care of the power supply, and maybe you sign a 5-year contract in advance that they provide power. The same you do with water and gas, because this allows the contract to reinvest and refinance the business. And I think we have to put that as not one nation together, we have to put it as a team together. And I would apply similar measures which you have in a normal city. When you get your internet link, when you get your power, you maybe sign a long-term contract because you get price guarantee. And with this, you can refinance it. This is how big infrastructure projects are done all over the world with the World Bank. And maybe then having a license from the UN, like you have on the high sea, to explore the ground. Not to sell it, but maybe 100 years of usage. I think we have to work on that.
I think this is a topic that we could delve into for quite a long time. So I would actually invite people who are listening to join us on the Q&A, and I think we should go into that in a little more depth on the Q&A. I guess a quick question, Anne, you say you're an Earthling. Frank, Joshua, would you go? Would you go live on the Moon or Mars if you had the chance?
Yeah.
I would first ask my wife.
Oh, you'd need permission. Okay. So those sorts of things need to be negotiated. The Mars in particular is a long way away. Okay, so one last quick fire thought from each of you. We only have about 60 seconds to share these thoughts, but why do you work in the space sector, Frank?
It's so exciting and opens me every day new doors and new dreams and new possibilities.
Joshua?
Exactly what Frank just said. The main thing is it's super exciting.
Anne?
It's very international, and you get to do things that impact a lot of lives on Earth all at the same time in a very, very exciting technology.
I think for myself, it has to do with how rapidly the sector is changing, which is exciting, but also which means that for my children and my children's children, space is going to become, a much more everyday, commonplace, line of work. And I just find it very exciting to be in at the front end of that in a way. I think we are out of time.
Thanks for an excellent panel, Katherine. If you would like to keep the conversation going, please head over to the CogX virtual platform and find the Q&A session for this panel. It will not be broadcast on YouTube, so if you have the right kind of ticket to join it from the platform, keep posting your questions on Slido and the panel will answer them. Meanwhile, you are listening to CogX 2020, where our theme is, how do we get the next 10 years right? This is the Planet, Cities and Space stage. Our next show on the main stage will begin at 5 p.m, where we will hear from Microsoft on the move beyond net zero to net negative carbon. I hope to see you all there.